Environment and ecology are important for the upcoming UPSC Prelims 2023 exam. One important reason being that Indian Forest Service exam and Civil Services exam have a combined prelims paper. So in today's video, we'll be learning how environment and ecology questions are very predictable and how to study smart and manage vast content. Number 3, what's the bare minimum preparation expected from us when it comes to prelims in general and environment and ecology in particular. And 4th, how Dominate Prelims 2.0 will help you boost your prelims score through PYQ based preparation. Quickly starting with the agenda, the first thing that we are going to observe in the environment questions of past year papers is there are a few connecting threads. As you can see on your screen, connecting thread number 1, which is direct recycling of questions. So let's see what is this direct recycling of questions happening. Now earlier there was this question in 2020 now there was this statement which said Central Groundwater Authority was formed under the Environment Protection Act, and 2 years later in 2022 there was a direct question drawn from that option which said which of the following has been constituted under the Environment Protection Act 1986, and the correct answer was Central Groundwater Authority. So a direct recycling has been done here. A statement we just mentioned, CGWA and Environment Protection Act, has been chosen by the paper setter, and a complete question has been framed using that. A similar example in 2019. Now this example is even more interesting. In 2019 there was this question, carbon monoxide, methane, ozone, sulfur, and there was a subsequent question. What is interesting is 3 years later in 2022 there was a very similar question. Now if you observe in these two questions, this earlier question in 2019 and this later question in 2022 have three things in common: carbon monoxide, ozone, and sulfur dioxide. Again here, carbon monoxide, ozone, and sulfur dioxide, these are common. What has been changed is methane and nitrogen oxide. Otherwise, three options among the four are as they were. So it almost seems as if while framing the paper setter was so bored that he chose to pick up the already made statements, the already made options, and he chose to frame a question around them. So again, it is a very good example of how UPSC or the paper setter recycles questions quite directly. Now moving ahead, connecting thread 1, direct recycling of questions we have just seen, but having this thread in mind, this connecting thread number 1 in mind, what could be the possible questions that could emanate? Let's take a few examples. Now this was a question asked in 2021 and there were 4 options given: carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, sulfur cycle. The answer was phosphorus cycle. But given the fact that we have just learned that direct recycling of statements, direct recycling of options is being done, we have seen in these examples. So if UPSC chooses to do the same in the upcoming paper, we are taking example of carbon cycle, and if it is recycled, what should we be prepared for? Now the bare minimum aspects about carbon cycle that we are expected to know is with respect to photosynthesis and respiration involved in carbon cycle, role of bacteria and fungi, mechanism of ocean uptake, carbon sequestration in forests and soil, carbonate weathering, and so on. Now this is not an exhaustive list. We'll be doing this in great detail in the class. This is just for our reference purpose. Okay, so this was one example of carbon cycle if a direct recycling is done by the paper setter. Again, number 2, we take example of this 2021 question where there are 4 options given and we are choosing pearl millet. If the examiner so chooses to recycle and frame a complete question on pearl millet, what could he do, or what is the bare minimum preparation expected from us? It is grown in which parts of India, it is important, as drought tolerant crop. What is its importance in this respect? Its utility in biofuel production, its linkage with National Food Security Mission, PUSA hybrid, and so on. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. Again, we probed two questions of past year papers. One was this, where the answer was phosphorus cycle, but we chose carbon cycle for our convenience purpose. And similarly, there was this another question, and we chose pearl millet from this question, just because we have learned that direct recycling, connecting thread number one between questions from different years, is that direct recycling of questions, direct recycling of statements, or direct recycling of options is being done by the paper setter. That is quite visible to us. Moving ahead very quickly, connecting thread number two. Now this is indirect recycling of questions. Earlier what we saw was direct recycling. Now let's see what is indirect recycling of questions. Now there was this question in 2020 which said if a particular plant species is placed under Schedule 6 of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, which is the implication? And option A was the correct answer. A license is required to cultivate that plant. So this question was on the specific provision of Wildlife Protection Act. Fine. Now moving ahead, in 2022, 2 years later, there was again this question on Wildlife Protection Act itself. Now, Wildlife Protection Act was not explicitly mentioned, but the question was drawn from that very act. When the question said wild animals are sole property of the government, when a wild animal is declared protected, such an animal is entitled for XYZ and so on. Now, if you look closely, now this is the bare act of Wildlife Protection Act, where it clearly states that wild animals etc. are to be the government property. There is no second thought about that. So what have we learned so far? In an earlier year in 2020, UPSC had asked a question on Wildlife Protection Act, and it chose to stick around that particular act and ask another question in another manner, but the source of the question was the same, which was Wildlife Protection Act. Let's see a similar question. In 2019, UPSC had asked a question where it said in this statement 1, agricultural soils release nitrogen oxides into environment. Fine. Again in 2022, 3 years later, there was this question: among the following crops, which one is the most important anthropogenic source of both methane and nitrous oxide? Now, how is this an indirect linkage? Here, the statement clearly mentioned agricultural soils release nitrogen oxides into environment, taking it a step ahead. Now, this is an indirect linkage, not a direct one. Taking it a step ahead, what UPSC has said, crops, which one is the most important anthropogenic source of nitrous oxide? And the answer is rice, obviously. So the format, the manner of asking the question has been changed, but the rule, the principle remains the same. In the earlier question, release of nitrous oxide, release of nitrogen oxide into environment was the emphasis. Again here, release of nitrous oxide in the environment is the emphasis. Now the question has been asked in superlative terms, which means which one is the most important anthropogenic source, and the answer happens to be rice. So again, yet another indirect linkage that we saw. The earlier indirect linkage that we saw was with respect to Wildlife Protection Act, asked in 2 subsequent years in a different manner. Similarly, this another question that we saw, nitrogen oxides being released into environment from agriculture. Agriculture is important. Then again in the next year, there was this indirect linkage where anthropogenic source of nitrous oxide was asked, and rice was the correct answer. So connecting thread 2, what have we learned so far? Indirect recycling of questions is happening, but the most logical question that should come to our mind is what could be the possible future questions that could emanate through this indirect linkage or indirect recycling of questions. So let's take an example of this question. Now this was asked in 2022. which asked which of the following are nitrogen fixing plants, and a list of 6 plants was given. Now our point of interest is nitrogen fixation or nitrogen fixing plants. Now keeping in mind that indirect linkages are being made, we will keep this in mind. And what could be the future questions on nitrogen fixation? Number 1, which bacteria, archaea and algae are involved, how it helps in synthesis of essential molecules, steps involved in nitrogen fixation, its usage as biofertilizers, and so on. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. Moving ahead, let's take one more example where indirect linkages can be made for the upcoming exam. Now this was again asked in 2021. The question was, which one of the following are detrivores? A list of 5 creatures was given. Now again, keeping in mind that indirect linkages are being made here, what could be a possible future question on detritus food chain? The question was on detritivores, but we are probing for possible future questions on detritus food chain. What could be the possible questions on number 1, agents involved, number 2, mechanism of decomposition, number 3, role of bacteria, fungi, larger detrivores like snails, crustaceans, etc., interlinkage with grazing food chain, leaf cutting ants, and why are they called as ecosystem engineers? By the way, there was a direct question on this in 2022 paper itself. Ants are cultivators of fungi. So what have we learned so far? Connecting thread 1, where there is direct recycling of options, direct recycling of questions. In connecting thread 2, there is indirect recycling of questions. Now let's move to connecting thread 3, in which the questions pivot around a common hinge. Now what does it mean when I say that the questions pivot around a common hinge? Let's try to take an example. Now there was this question in 2021 which asked the common carbon metric supported by UNEP has been developed by, and in the next year in 2022 there was this question on climate action tracker. Now the names are common carbon metric and climate action tracker. What is the connecting link between these two questions? The connecting link or the hinge between these two questions is both are carbon measuring tools. Now be it common carbon metric or climate action tracker, essentially both are carbon measuring tools. Now that's the hinge between them. Now having this thing in mind, at level 3, level 1 was direct recycling, level 2 was indirect recycling, level 3 is pivoting around a common hinge. Now we have understood what's the hinge between these two questions in 2021 and 2022. These are carbon measuring tools asked one after the year. Let's try to understand, or let's try to take an example of a similar question asked in 2021 and what possible questions could emanate using these level 3 analysis, where we are trying to probe the hinge around which possible questions could pivot. The keyword over here is R2 code of practices. R2 code of practices constitutes a tool available for promoting the adoption of, and the correct answer was option A, environmentally sustainable practices in electronics recycling industry. So what is the hinge? What is the hinge here? The hinge is sustainable practices in industries, or in industries or in industrial sector in general. Sustainable practices in industrial sector. So what could be the possible questions that could emanate in the upcoming prelims paper? Now, one could definitely be perform, achieve and trade, that is the PACT scheme. Number 2, roundtable on sustainable palm oil, RSPO. IGBC green homes rating system. Number 4, star labeling program of BEE, and so on. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. We'll do this in great detail in the class. So far we have seen 3 linkages, 3 steps, 3 levels. One was direct recycling of options, direct recycling of questions. Another was indirect recycling of questions. Number 3 was how questions pivot around a common hinge. And we have tried to predict or prepare ourselves for similar upcoming questions in the upcoming Prelims 2023 paper. Now, Dominate Prelims 2.0. Guys, we have started with Dominate Prelims 2.0 initiative to help you guys with a very similar kind of PYQ analysis and being prepared for the upcoming prelims exam based on such methodical PYQ analysis. Now, this will be done both for static and current affairs, which could be derived from past year paper PYQ analysis, which would be very relevant and highly likely to replicate in the upcoming Prelims 2023 paper. Also, you'll have a 10 days workshop for learning intelligent paper solving skills, where you will learn, in case you have little or zero idea about a question, how do you attempt that particular questions correctly. Number 3, you'll also have 10 more days of workshop for PYQ based preparation. There again we'll be doing PYQ analysis and preparing ourselves for the most important facts, facets, information, concepts relevant for the upcoming Prelims 2023 exam. The joining link of the program is given in the description box below. And lastly, do comment in the comment section below. Just pour your heart out. Negative comment, positive comment, doesn't matter. Just pour your heart out. So this was all in today's video. This is Zeeshan Hashmi signing off.